Our Bible text today is John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Let's read together. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." In our passage today, we return to Bethany, which was the scene of Lazarus' resurrection from the grave that we studied last week. Now, since then, in Bible times, a few weeks have passed. Jesus has returned to this little village, and a banquet is being thrown in his honor. Martha's in the kitchen, whipping up food and serving everyone. Lazarus is sitting at the table or laying at the table next to Jesus, eating and drinking, giving proof of his resurrection from the dead. And then there is Mary. Mary enters the banquet room carrying a jar filled with a perfumed oil. Now, at first, there's nothing surprising about what Mary is doing. Just consider the conditions at the time. They didn't have deodorant back then. They didn't have indoor plumbing, so they didn't bathe regularly. There was no coconut rainfall scented body wash. There was no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no mouthwash. On top of that, it's a really hot climate. So to just kind of state it directly, it probably reeked pretty bad. So at banquets like this, it was customary for the host or hostess to bring out some perfume, some scented oil, and to place it on the head of each of the guests so that it would be manageable for everyone to be cooped up in the same room together for a few hours. But as Mary was doing this, she did something that was unexpected, something that shocked everybody. In Mark's account of this dinner, which is in chapter 14 of his gospel, he tells us that Mary broke the neck of the jar. Now, this was so she could get out more than just a drop at a time. By breaking off the neck, she would be able to pour it out. And that is just what she did. Mary poured all of it out on Jesus. Now, this was an amazing thing to do, as we will discover in the next few moments. But it's amazing, I think, for no greater reason than in just this brief single act, Mary shows us, demonstrates for us what it means to give your entire life to Jesus. Mary is showing us, what does it look like to give your life to Jesus? Now, certainly, as followers of Jesus, this is something of great importance to us. So let's take our time to study. First, we see that Mary gave all she had to Jesus. This was a very, very costly gift that she had poured out. She had a jar full of nard, which was an expensive perfumed oil that came from India. And as we see in the passage here, Judas says it was worth about 300 days' wages for a common laborer. So we factor in the Sabbath, 52 days they don't work. It's a year's salary, which would put it maybe $30,000, $40,000, if not more, in today's wages. This stuff was like so precious that it was used to anoint kings at like inaugurations and stuff and coronations. Now, because of its great value, some people think that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were wealthy. Now, even if this were true, we don't know, but even if it were true, there is no way that they are so wealthy that this is not going to hurt them. But Mary is willing to give away her worldly wealth for the sake of Jesus, whom she considers to be of far greater value and worth. Now, it's also quite possible that Mary was not a wealthy person, and this jar might have been just a family legacy that had been passed down to her. In that case, this perfume represented her financial security. It was her safety net, her rainy day fund, her 401k, her pension, her brokerage account, and her life savings all rolled into one jar. Now, whatever her financial situation was, we can be sure that when Mary was giving this gift, this excessive gift to Jesus, it wasn't like she had a bunch of spare ones in the back, like she had another dozen in the back room. Like, this was it. Mary is giving Jesus everything she has, and she dumps it all out in a matter of seconds and saves not a drop for herself. So it's no wonder Jesus is moved by this act of devotion, because in this moment, Mary, she says something with her actions far more than she could say with her words. And what she's really saying is, no matter the cost, Jesus, I will follow you. Even if it costs me everything, even if it demands my very last penny, you can have it, Jesus. So Mary's gift makes us wonder what we would do in that position. So let's insert ourselves in the story. Mary gave up all she had for Jesus. Would we have been willing to do the same? Are we willing to do the same today? This is a great question for us to ask as we get started on the season of Lent this week. Now let's talk about Lent just very briefly. As many of you know, Lent is a time where Christians engage in self-examination and a lot of reflection. We look ahead to the cross, we consider what Christ has done, and all the sin in our lives that led him there. And Lent is also a time of sacrifice, a time where we purposely choose to do without, a time of self-denial, a time to pull ourselves away from the things of the world and focus more on Jesus. So let me ask you as we get started on Lent, when have you ever given something to Jesus that cost you dearly? Maybe it was money. Maybe it was a career opportunity that would just take you away from the Lord or lead you in a path away from God. Did you ever give up a vacation because you wanted to use those resources for the Lord? Or maybe you gave up a potential marriage partner because you were unequally yoked and you knew that they were going to pull you away from God. Or a hobby that just took up a bunch of your time that you laid down because it was interfering in your walk. Have you ever given something to Jesus that cost you dearly? And like Mary, not because Jesus demanded it of you, but because you wanted to. It was a gift given unprompted. Have you ever given something, and I would say beyond the meaningless gestures that are often associated with Lent? Things like, I'm going to give up chocolate chips for the next 6 or 7 weeks, or I'm going to give up $8 Starbucks mocha frappuccinos, whatever. And I say meaningless because those things are all just given out of the extreme excess in which we live. And I say meaningless because of how foolish and little they sound when you compare it next to what Mary gave to Jesus. Maybe another way to ask this question of what would you be willing to give to Jesus is to kind of flip it upside down and say, is there anything you wouldn't be willing to give to Jesus because you value it so much, because it's so precious to you? Well, we see here in the story, Mary gave all she had. And what a great image that is of giving your life to Jesus, giving everything you have. But we see here that Mary actually gave more than everything she had. She also gave up her rights. She gave up her dignity as a person. She gave that over to Jesus as well in a very humbling act. You see, Mary poured the nard oil on Jesus' feet. We put the gospel accounts together and we know that she anointed Jesus' head and his feet. But John draws our attention to Jesus' feet, and he does it twice. Now, there's a good reason for that. In the Jewish culture in that day, there were certain things you could never ask your servant to do because it was considered too beneath them, too humiliating, too demeaning, and too dehumanizing. Now, washing and caring for somebody's feet was one of those things. And in a dusty culture with no paved roads and no, closed-toed shoes, we can see why that was. But this doesn't stop Mary from offering this foot service to Jesus. Mary, in anointing Jesus' feet with oil, is in effect telling him, not only can you count on me to offer you all that I have, you can also count on me to do anything you want for you, anything you ask at all. Now, again, putting ourselves in a story, I wonder how many of us have ever offered ourselves like that to Jesus. Are you willing to do anything for the Lord? Not that long ago, we had an event here at our church, and following it, we kind of made a bit of a mess, and it was time to clean up, and there were parents here and kids here, and everybody was pitching in. Well, not everybody. There was one parent who told their kid not to help because it wouldn't be very sanitary to help clean up. Now, when I heard about that, I kind of rolled my eyes and was kind of frustrated by that and thought, everybody else, how come you're the one person that, can't help clean up? And maybe you would have a similar reaction to me. But I'd say before we're too quick to judge that person or that family, think about this. Have you ever thought of any task as being beneath you? Or it was too gross, too dirty, too disgusting, or just too low of a level, of a job for you ever to do? Or maybe have you ever thought, you just don't want to do something, like you just have no interest, so you won't do it, whether it's serving at a mission or going on a trip somewhere, or serving in a impoverished neighborhood, a foreign country, or ministering to a certain type of people or a certain people group that you don't like or find offensive. Or maybe it's a task like sharing your faith openly in the workplace or in your family, or here at the church, teaching a class or discipling someone. And your response is just, no, I don't want to do that. You just kind of wait and stall and say, somebody else will do that. That's not for me. And we're all guilty of that, right? I mean, you are, I am, we all are. So let's compare that response, though, to Mary, for whom no such attitude exists. It's like, whatever you want, Jesus, I'll do it. And in that, we see clearly what it means to give your entire life to Jesus. She gives him everything she has, and she surrenders all her rights and her pride and her dignity for Jesus. But Mary's devotion, it doesn't even stop there. By her actions, we know that she gave him her whole heart. Mary wiped down the oil on Jesus' feet with her hair. Now, to do that, she was going to have to let her hair down. Jewish women, they all had long hair. They weren't allowed to cut it, and they would always wear it up. A proper Jewish woman would never let her hair down in front of anyone except her husband, and never outside the family, and certainly never in front of other men. And by letting her hair down in front of Jesus, Mary is showing in a very personal way her love and a desire for an intimate relationship with Jesus. Now, not in the scandalous or inappropriate way, but this is just in her culture, her way of expressing that. To say, Jesus, I love you. I am completely yours. I love you with all my heart, all my soul, all my mind, all my being and all my strength, and I give myself to you joyfully and willingly. Once again, Mary's actions make us self-examine. How much do I love Jesus? How much do you love Jesus? Have you given him all of your heart? That's a good question for us, right? I mean, because it's one thing to know who Jesus is. It's one thing to know the gospel story and to understand it. It's another thing to agree with the theology of the church. It's another thing to, be active in serving and participating and showing up to different events and things like that. But it's another thing to love him desperately. And that brings us to the very center, the very core of what it means to give your life to Jesus. For you to give your life to Jesus is to declare, I love you, Jesus, more than anything else, more than my husband or my wife, more than my kids, more than my parents, more than my career, more than my grades, more than my sports, more than my money, more than my friends, more than my popularity, more than anything else this whole world has to offer. I love you more. I love you the most. And giving you, Jesus, whatever you ask, and serving in whatever capacity I can, will be my joy. There's an old familiar hymn, Take My Life and Let It Be, that really perfectly mirrors what Mary is doing here in John 12 at this dinner banquet. When she pours out the perfume on Jesus, it's as if she is saying, take my silver and my gold, not a mite with I withhold. And when she touches his feet, she's saying, take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. And when she lets down her hair and she wipes his feet, she's saying, take my love, my Lord, I pour. At your feet its treasure store. Take myself and I will be ever only all for thee. This is what it looks like to give yourself, to give your life over to Jesus. And Mary does it so beautifully. It's no wonder that some people have called her the greatest disciple. Now, as wonderful as Mary's act of devotion was, she was criticized for it, and harshly. She was rebuked, and in our text here we see it was Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, who called her out on this. And Judas's accusation was this, that what Mary did was a waste. She wasted her nard, her perfumed oil. She could have sold it and given money to the poor. Now, at first glance, we might have some sympathy for Judas's line of thinking, because if we're honest, what Mary did, it was very impractical on a kind of very basic level. Like, it really didn't make a lot of sense. Think of all the good it could have done. The name Bethany, the village where they live in, means house of the poor. And it's likely that this village was something like a first century hospice, or was a place for invalids. And this banquet is even being held in the home of Simon the leper. So perhaps it was a leper colony as well. This bottle of nard, if it was sold, could have gone a really long way to help others. But Judas's protest is quickly revealed to be disingenuous. John tells us not only that Judas was the treasurer for Jesus' ministry, but he was also a thief. He'd not given his heart to Jesus the way Mary had. Judas had given his heart to money. Now, Mary's devotion to Jesus and her act, it really offended Jesus or Judas, not because Judas is really thinking, we could have helped so many poor people. He's thinking all that he could have gained himself. All he could think of is when Mary is pouring out the oil was the cut of money he might have taken if he had been given this jar and then sold it. What a contrast between Mary and Judas. Mary broke her bottle to give all she had to Jesus, while Judas wanted to break in to the money pouch to take from Jesus. Now, when Mary did this, and as we find out later, Jesus approves, it is likely this is the final straw for Judas. Because immediately after this, he goes to the high priest and he agrees to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which was the price of a slave. Now, of course, this would be a great injustice, but Judas was going to get his money from Jesus one way or the other. Now, if nothing else, this story shows us, Judas shows us how persuasively and convincingly a hypocrite can play the role of a disciple. In addition to that, it shows us how we can use practicality as a mask to cover a wicked and corrupt heart. We'll get back to that in a moment. But we cannot lay all the blame on Jesus. In Mark's account, we find out it wasn't just Judas, it was all the disciples that scolded Mary to her face and told her that she had wasted this precious nard. They all agreed that there would have been far better uses than to pour it all out on Jesus. Now, when a Christian, when a follower of Jesus does something lavish and extravagant, I can understand why the outside world criticizes it. They don't get it. They don't understand the value and the worth of Jesus. They don't have a relationship with him. But what about when it happens inside the church? And it does happen when people become critical of the acts of others. Why is that? Well, I have a couple theories. One, maybe we're jealous. Maybe somebody has done something that we ourselves could not do. Maybe that's what the disciples were thinking, like, I could have never given that to Jesus. And instead of admitting that, they just tear Mary down for being wasteful and being imprudent and not very practical. Or maybe, like Judas and the other disciples, deep down on some level, we just don't think it's worth it. It's not worth giving it to Jesus. We can just imagine the disciples gossiping to one another, how this whole thing Mary does, like, it's so excessive, it's so over the top, it's so dramatic. And in their gossip, do we not hear the echo of our own protests of, I can't spend a whole weekend on a retreat or spend my vacation days going on a conference, or I'd help out, but not every Wednesday night. I mean, come on, every Wednesday night? Who has that kind of time? Or I think when people get antsy when worship goes beyond 65 or 70 minutes, and it's like, come on, we've got other things to do. We've got better places to be. I think sometimes we congratulate ourselves on how practical we are. Again, just to kind of mask our unwillingness to give wholly and fully to Christ. So Jesus steps in now. The men are yelling, scolding at Mary, and Jesus comes in and he says, leave her alone. Leave her alone. This wasn't a waste. In fact, this gift was well spent. Now, certainly the money could have been given to the poor. There are always going to be opportunities to minister to the poor, and we should. Jesus is a great example of that. But the world was not always going to have Jesus. Mary understood how special Jesus was. He was God the Son, and she had insight into the significance of the moment. She knew Jesus had come to die, and she was saving this nard for his burial. And sensing that the time of his death was near, she poured it all out. The extravagance of her love for Jesus, fully expressed. And yet, as extravagant as Mary's gift was to Jesus, Jesus would give a far greater gift. Jesus would soon match and exceed all that Mary had done. By the end of the week, Jesus would offer the most extravagant gift ever given and at the greatest price ever paid. Consider what Jesus did to gain our salvation, to provide us with an escape from a judgment for sin, and to escape the wrath of a holy God and the fires of hell, and make a way for us to go into heaven. Like Mary, what Jesus did was very costly. The gift of salvation, it cost him absolutely everything. And is Jesus not like this bottle that was broken? Broken his body was by the fist of the soldiers, by the whipping post, by the crown of thorns, by the nails of the cross, and by the soldiers' spears. And like that oil poured out, was that not just a picture of his blood, the precious blood of Jesus being poured out from the cross and soaking the ground beneath? A costly gift. And like Mary, Jesus gave up his rights, the Son of God going to the cross as a humble servant for humanity. We see a beautiful description of this in Philippians chapter 2. Though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. In being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. In his passion, God the Son places himself in the hands of men and submits himself to their crooked authority. And he hangs on the cross, exposed, humiliated, despised, and rejected at the very bottom rung of humanity and of all society. And like Mary, what Jesus did was deeply personal, motivated out of love. You know, Jesus died for the world, but he didn't just die for like generic humanity. He died for you. Whosoever believes in him, that's who he died for. And he died to save you, so there to be never again anything in between you and him. He died so that you might be forgiven of your sin, that his Spirit might move and dwell within you, that you might have life in him now and then in all eternity in his kingdom, forever and ever. And Jesus on the cross, it's the greatest declaration of him saying, I love you, here I am, take my life, I give it freely for you. Oh, if you only would know, if only we would know that we are loved like that. And all Christ asks is that we would receive it, just as he received Mary's gift, that we would receive his gift to us. In dying on the cross, Jesus proved that he was worth the gift that Mary offered. In fact, when you kind of go back and you consider the entirety of the stories, Mary's actions aren't even like that extreme or lavish. In fact, they're just quite appropriate. It makes perfect sense for her to give everything to Christ. But for Jesus to do what he did, to pay the penalty for our sin, that makes no sense at all. And it's just a sign of his ridiculous, extraordinary grace given to us. All done to welcome us home into his kingdom of light and love. So as we consider the awesome glory of Jesus Christ this Lenten season, what more could you and I ask for than a chance to give our life, all of it, to our precious Savior, Jesus?